Hello, welcome to La Fabrique. My name's Tom Elmhirst and we've just finished a week-long seminar specifically looking at mixing techniques. We've had 15 students from all over the world. We've had a great time, it's been hard work. But we've now got 10 questions that have been presented to me from people who are not on the course. So we're going to start with Patrick Kumenica, I hope I got that right. Hey Tom, what's your go-to vocal chain in the mix? I use a combination of vocal compressors. I've been using a Blackface Uri 1176 and I tend to change my second compressor and I'll explain why. I suppose the starting point for my vocal chain is a Neve 1081 module, which I take straight off the multi-track return, as in Pro Tools return, into a Neve 1081. That then goes into the Blackface Uri, and that then goes into, at the moment I'm using a TubeTech CL1B. I do sometimes switch that up. I have an old Altec compressor. I have a few different options. What I'm doing with the two compressors, the Neve I'm using is the line amp, remember, so I'm returning that in the insert return, which, you know, I'm trying to use a better vocal chain than a sort of vocal preamp, if you like, than my Neve console. The two compressors work in tandem, and this is just something I've sort of, I wouldn't say it's, you know, unique, but it's just, I use the Uri very fast release. It's not doing a lot, maximum on the meter, and meters don't always tell you everything, but the Uri will be doing maybe 5, 7 to 9 dB, and that may sound like a lot, but with a very fast release, it's just hitting what I call the heavy transients in a vocal. Then the TubeTech or something like an Altec will be behaving more like a Fairchild or a slower compressor, much slower attack and very slow release. Again, it's not doing crazy amounts of compression reduction, maybe 3, 4, 5 dB. And in my head, the concept behind it is that, yeah, the Uri slaps the sort of heavy transient when a vocal kicks up, and the TubeTech or the sort of the Fairchild or the whatever else I use, maybe an Altec, I have a Gates as well, that'll just be doing something, it's colouring the vocal, and obviously between those three different compressors I can change the colour and the sound, but it's picking up the slack, and it's you know, the difference between, say, a Uri, which is colourful in its own way, and something like a TubeTech or something like the Gates is that they work in tandem. I hope that answers your question, Patrick. Question 2, John Rook. Hey Tom, I know you like to work quickly and get into the mix as fast as possible. In my experience, mixing is all about your mindset. Do you have any tips for mentally preparing yourself before a mix session? That's a good question. Mixing is super instinctive, and what we've worked on during this week here is getting the students to get a balance together quite quickly, 20 minutes. Generally, if you spend, you know, an hour or two just fiddling around with drums in a mix or just getting certain things working, all that time you're tiring your ears, you're also acclimatizing your brain to a specific way of working, and you're going to find that it's harder to make interesting mix decisions and change the palette of a mix the longer the day goes on. So on my average day, I'll sit down at midday, 1 o'clock and start a mix. Within half an hour, and this is a multi-track I'll never have seen before, I want to have all the parts that I need access to coming up my console, and I'll have a working balance. It may not be the finished balance, there may be a long way to go, but within 20 minutes, half an hour, and again, yeah, a multi-track I've not seen before, I'll have everything working quite quickly. The reason, again, is so that my brain, my ears, and I'm not conditioning myself too quickly as to how this is, how the mix is going to take shape. There's lots of ways to, you know, approach a mix, mindset, if we look at that. I think mixing, inside you have to have a little aggression about you. It doesn't mean you're sort of bullish and throw things around, but you need to be slightly charged going into mix. There is an element in a mix, in my head, that is performance. It's not just a technical exercise. Of course there's techniques involved, but if you can come in a bit pumped up, if you like, it's not going to hurt the mix, I don't think. Now that could be you go play tennis for an hour before you start mixing, have a row with your girlfriend, whatever it is. You can do something that is going to make you come into the studio and do good work quickly. Okay, I hope that helps, John. Question 3, Mattia Maggi. Hello, Tom. Do you have a particular technique to get a solid and clean low end? No, is the answer. But, you know, you've got to hope. Solid and clean low end. Well, I mean, where is the low end coming from in your mix? That's the first thing to look at. Invariably, it's coming from bass drum, bass, maybe some other instruments, depending on the music or what the aesthetic of the track you're working on. But you've got to find it's balance. It goes back to just balance. And I've often said EQ. You know, when you add or take away EQ, you're altering the balance, aren't you? Now, another way to do it instead of adding EQ is to just move the fader in Pro Tools, on a console, however you're working. Bass and bass drums work in similar areas, and we know that. Now, I use a lot of high-pass filters on other instrumentation, so if you're not hearing, if your monitoring is not allowing you to hear, below 100 hertz information or below 150 hertz information, there might be all sorts of information getting in the way of your bass and bass drum. So, first point, you need good monitoring to get a clean low end. Why? Because you need to get rid of certain things below, in the area of bass drum and bass. That's really critical. Say an acoustic guitar or a vocal or a piano, anything below 80, unless you really want it, is going to get in the way of your clean low end. Then the battle is between the bass drum and the bass, and they operate in a similar area. You might find if you boost 50, 60 hertz on a bass drum, that you're going to have to take that out of the bass. If the bass is a melodic part, more musical, you're going to want to be boosting around 200 in that area. It very much depends on the material. But high-pass filters on other things clears out the bass, so you can get this clean low end you're asking about, Mattia. I hope that helps. Okay. Question 4, Anthony Pilato. Hi. Hi, Tom. What are your methods for creating width and depth in a mix? Thanks. That's a good question. Width and depth, again, quite sort of visual, a visual question in my head. And you can achieve that in a variety of ways. Obviously, width panning, using your pan pot is a great way to create width. If everything's coming up the middle, A, it's going to be in mono, but B, you're not going to get width. So use the pan pot. Some people are sort of Beatles-esque in their panning, which can be either left, middle, or right. Other people like sort of more subtle panning. The more abstract and the more eccentric you're panning, if you like, the more width you're going to achieve. In a mixed situation, I quite enjoy having things feel like they come in and out. So you may start with your verse with instrumentation quite panned quite centrally, then try when you go to the chorus to have things dramatically, accentuate the left and the right. Depth is another thing, depth of field, and that's the hardest thing to achieve. If all your music or if all the parts in your multi-track are at the same volume, same level, and are all dry, no effects, nothing, you're going to have no depth. Now again, it goes back to the mono stereo thing. That can be great for the verse. Then if you want to start getting some depth in the chorus, you need effects. You need, pre-delays into reverbs. I use a technique of a delay off the bus going into a quite wide sort of reverb. So there's already maybe a 200 millisecond delay. You're not hearing that delay because it's then going to a reverb. So I can keep a vocal quite present in the mix, but I've got a thing behind it that will sort of act like a sort of cotton wool cushion that I can play with, and I'll ride the send from a vocal into that, and it will change throughout a song. Again, creating a sense of depth. I think that covers that. Okay. Anders Sigrist Oliver. Hi, Tom. How do you create such driven but yet pleasant, open, dynamic vocals when mixing. I'm spending the most time on the vocal in a mix. Vocals and drums is the hardest work. Why? Because the vocal is your principal object invariably in popular music, so the vocal is going to be the loudest thing in the mix. Drums also, you know, I found a lot of the times working with students, the balances tend to become quite safe. All instrumentation is sort of operating at the same level. To get it dynamic mixes, and when you talk about open vocals, I think you're meaning that the vocal's quite clear and present. You need to make room for it. Now, that can reference back to the question before, which is panning. Get things out of the way of the vocal. Your vocal, your bass drum, your bass are going to be your sort of central objects in the mix. If you've got a lot of other things cluttering that, you're not going to have room for your vocal. The driven part of the question is trickier. You know, there are techniques such as, you know, reamping a vocal. I've quite often put vocal onto a piece of tape to get a bit of tape saturation, then put it back in the session. If you don't have access to tape, you can use plugins. There's many plugins that sort of drive a vocal a bit, be it Amp Farm, be it Lo-Fi, Speakerphone is a good plugin for this. There's many ways to do it, but you've got to be careful with distortion and driving a vocal, because obviously you're gonna start blurring the lines, and that you've got to be careful with that. So it's something you should be constantly playing with while the mix is going on. But I think there's a couple of techniques there that I've explained. I hope that helps. Ronnie Dangle. Hi Tom, I'm a huge fan of your work and sound since I've discovered The Kills, great band. I really love the way how you handle the low end in your mixes. Your kick drums sound airy and wide, but still have a lot of punch. How do you achieve that? Is it a combination of room mics, or do you use a room reverb for kick drum? I don't. What's your go-to EQ and compressor for it? Thanks a lot, wish you the best. Okay, a couple of different questions there. I like low end, so I'm always gonna, you know, try and really work on the low end. This question has somewhat been answered by the first point. Use high-pass filters on other things. Leave the low end for your bass drum and bass. You're just going to make more room immediately by doing that. A combination of room mics, or do you use room reverb for kick drum? I do not, on the whole, use reverb for kick drum, unless the bass drum has been pretty badly recorded. I use a lot of room mics depending on it depends on the material, of course. Your kick drums sound airy and wide but still have a lot of punch. How do you achieve that? I mean, it depends on very much on the material, but I quite often on a lot of tracks I'll add samples to help me. So if it's a live drum kit, which is hard to record, let's not, you know, we have to accept that. Not everyone gets a great room, a great drummer, a great kit, but I'll use a sample to help me get definition if I need it. And you know, in certain sections of the song, I'll want reverb or room, and I can play with it. My go-to EQ and compressor, I really like the DBX, the original DBX 160, and EQ-wise, I'll use two Neve 1081 channels again. I have a few Neve modules, and I give them to the principal objects in the mix, which for me quite often are bass drum, snare, bass, vocal, and those things are up the middle, so they're really important. You know, they're going to take up a lot of room in the mix, and I want to, you know, treat them well. The DBX compressors, the 160 is quite an aggressive compressor, but it can really help control, you know, especially with a live kit, control the environment that it's doing that. And then if I balance that with my samples, I've got lots of options. I hope that answers your question, Ronnie. There's a question from Julio Alberto Arredondo. Tom, love the tonal balance, dynamics and sense of space of your mixes. How do you use EQ? I mean, your mixes sound pristine, yet they don't sound harsh. A lot of carving with EQ. What about your drum samples, drum bus? 3 or 4 questions there. Tonal balance, dynamics and sense of space of your mixes. How do you use EQ? Well, that kind of is going to be answered by the next question, which is they sound pristine, yet they don't sound harsh. A lot of carving with EQ. Yes is the answer. I do much more reductive EQ than additive EQ. My mix bus is where I'm doing quite a lot of general EQ. And I'll get my mix bus working very early on in the mix. Because if I'm adding, I use a curve bender, the TG curve bender of my mix bus. I've used it for quite a while. If I'm adding, I don't know, 3, I don't know if that's dB, but 3 at 20K, which I seem to be doing, no, I'm adding 6 today, 5. If I'm adding quite a lot of mix bus EQ, I'm not going to need to do, it's going to take care of my mix, if you like. I'm not going to have to go through each channel and do it. Obviously, you're going to have individual things, but on the console, on my VR, I'm using a very high Q to take out frequencies I don't like, and they're invariably between 2 and 6K. I would stress that I don't look at the frequencies. I turn the gain full and find what I don't like, and then take it out. It's that simple. Now, EQ is very personal, like mixing. You're going to find frequencies you like or don't like and boost them and not. It's just taste. But I don't like harshness. So much music these days to me is very hard, very harsh. Sometimes it's hard to sometimes you need it. If you think of sort of indie rock bands or what have you, it's part of the sound, this harshness or quite high mid-range frequencies and it makes a mix aggressive and exciting, but I'm not always a fan of it in the work I do. And I like space, I like open, and I like dynamics. Tonal balance, dynamics, and sense of space. Well, I mean, the using EQ, sorry, I'm going back to the first part of the question, but I use EQ to make space for other things. So if I start taking away the frequencies I don't like in a mix, I'm going to make room for other frequencies and other things. And if I'm constantly taking away that sort of 2 to 6K area, I'm taking away harshness, and that's going to make the instruments more open and give the mix a more open sense of space, if you like. What about your drum samples and drum bus? My drum samples, I'm not going to lie, I've been using the same 2 drum samples for 10 years. Bass drum I made of several samples and a snare. Now the main thing with drum samples, and you've got to be careful here, I think, is you don't always want to hear them. In a live drum kit, I feel like I can get away with a bit more samples, but it's got to be program related, mix related, or that's not to say that what I'm using them for is not the sound of the sample. It's to work in tandem with the live drum or whatever the bass drum is in the thing. And I don't use them every time. I can think of many records where I haven't used any samples at all because it was available to me on tape. I'm using the samples for a purpose, to get definition if it's not there in the recording. And yeah, it's as simple as that. Drum bus, I use the TG1 limiter, again, the Chandler TG1. And I just use, it's the only parallel compression I generally do in mixes. So I'm sending, if I've got the drums over 7 or 8 channels, I might send just the overhead mics or just the room mics to parallel compressor. And what it'll give me is the option, and I've got a fader to ride into the compressor, and I've also got the return of the compressor. So I can do a lot of different things. Again, going back to the question earlier, which was how do you get a sense of depth and width? Well, if I start riding, if I have no parallel drum compression in the verse, and I button it in on the bridge or the chorus, suddenly a whole new thing's available to me, and you get that lovely sucking, and on my TG I have it in limit mode, so it's actually, it's doing a hell of a lot. You've got to be careful with the phase, you've got to listen to that. Sometimes I might try and EQ the return differently, so these things are not cancelling each other out or getting in each other's way. I might put a crazy reverb on the return of the drum bus compressor, just to make it a different thing, and that's how I use them. But the samples, you've got to be careful with samples because depending on your artist or the production, you don't want your sample to be the thing that is heard. It's there to sort of fulfill a job, not to be the principal object. I hope that helps. Dylan Seals, question from Dylan Seals. Hi Tom, tell us more about your multiple tight notch reductive EQ techniques for vocal. Again, the vocal is the hardest thing in a mix to get right. It's going to be the loudest thing in the mix. If you're working with a solo artist, it's the thing in the mix. So I'm constantly EQing a vocal throughout the mix. I don't EQ once and then go, that's it. What I might find in a song, again I'll talk about sections of a song, is that generally the chorus is the busiest part of a song. I might find I'm really battling harshness there. I may separate the vocal. I can do it in Pro Tools, I can do it on the board, but I'll probably do it in Pro Tools, and I use the waves Q, 3, 4, 5 and 6, whatever they're called, and I'll go and find frequencies I don't like and reduce them. I love it if I can get an EQ setting or a compressor setting or whatever that works throughout the song. Quite often now, because we're doing dynamic mixes and the material requires a different approach for sections of a song, I'll split the vocal in Pro Tools, very easy. And if there's a lot more information happening in the chorus, well, I might want the vocal harder. So if I'm taking those 2, 3, 4, 5K frequencies out in the verse, I might leave them in the chorus, or conversely. But the way I do it is very simply is boost the frequency at about 80 on the Q setting on the Waves plugin, boost it all the way, and then just move the frequency band around until I find what I don't like, and then I take it out. Now, obviously if you've got time, you can automate these settings. It's very fast and very easy to do, but I'm just listening to the things that I personally don't like, which is that harshness that we're talking about. And I find that really works. What I invariably do after that, and I do quite often, I might have a Pultec, or I might go over to my Neve, and I might add top end back in there, because if you're taking out a lot of harshness, you want to still keep that sense of air. And on the Neve, I'll add 15K, something like that, and that helps. Okay. And finally, a question from Adam Denny. Hi Tom, would love to know what is on your master bus and how you approach anything that is on there, EQ, compression, etc. I've had the same things on my master bus for several years now. It works for me. We're all going to find different bits of gear, what have you, that are going to help you with your mix bus. It depends on the material, depends on how you work, how you like to work. But I used to mix half-inch tape when I started, and half-inch tape gives you saturation, which is, I suppose, what some people call glue in a mix. It's the hardest thing to get, where you get everything sort of working together and gelling, if you like. So on my mix bus I have, and I think it goes in this order, I have the EMI curve bender, which is the Chandler, and then I go into the Manley, which is a Very compressor, and then I go into something called a crane song head, yeah, which I'm using for a bit of saturation. Obviously, when I was an assistant engineer, I watched several different engineers use different approaches to their mix bus, but I like the way these things work in tandem, and I watched an engineer that I respect use them, and I found something that fits for me. It's very personal what you use, how you use it, but invariably on my curve bender, I'm adding 20K. You could argue who's going to hear it. Well, it's not. It's that openness that someone else has asked about, to get this sort of sense of air. I boost 20K, and sometimes all the way. The curve bend is quite a musical EQ, not sort of as tight and as maybe not quite as softer EQ than something like the GML. And I'm adding 72 hertz invariably on that. I might then actually add a bit of 8K, but it's again totally program related or mix related. The Very is quite a specific compressor, and it's not for everyone. Some people don't like it. What I like about it, and I use it in link mode. Some people like their left and rights to be acting independently. I don't. In my head, I want a stereo picture, and if something's panned hard left, it will trigger both sides. So be it. That's how I like it. But the Very for me, and you know, watching meters isn't always the best way to do it, because you can either get shocked or you don't think it's doing enough, but you have to very much use your ears with something like a mixed bus compressor. I'm invariably on either medium release time or medium to fast. Again, program related, dance music or something with quite electronic drums and so on. You don't want slow releases. You want something that recovers quite quickly, if that makes sense. But the main thing that the Vari-Mu is doing is, because the vocal's the loudest thing in the mix, I'm using the Vari-Mu to sort of govern the mix compressor. If I have the vocal up, the mix compressor is doing its work. When the vocal stops, if you like, and they don't often stop, but when there's a break in that, it allows the music to come back a bit, and so it's quite a sort of, I suppose, old approach to how a compressor works. In that it's very much based on the singer driving the compressor, and when the singer stops, it sort of comes back. I think that makes sense. The crane song, which is the last thing in the chain, and I use it as my A to D also. It's my converter back into Pro Tools. I'm only using, there's a button called tape, and it's great. It allows me to get some sense of that tape saturation that I got from half-inch tape, or putting mixes onto half-inch tape. And sometimes I find still with acoustic material, I want to put it on half-inch tape. More electronic-based material, I'm just going to, realistically, it's going to go straight back in the computer. I don't want it saturated. It's not the aesthetic, that's required for that thing. So I hope these answers have helped with your questions, and some of these things have all tied into each other. Someone asked again about dynamic and open mixes. I do a lot of fader rides. If I'm not doing a lot of mixed bus compression, which I'm never trying to do too much, it's going to go to mastering. It's going to get help on that respect. But I'll do rides with faders, and that's where faders for me in a console is so important, because I can create dynamics, with faders, and that's half the thing. I find very much the lesson I think that we've looked at this week is that if the mix is sounding boring to you, or you're bored during the mix, and chances are that the listener or someone who listens to your mix down the line is going to be bored too. And you must try, if you can, either to come into the studio, slightly excited to be doing this, because that's going to translate into your mix. And I hope that helps. Thank you very much.